Steve Stewart-Williams. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
It's my pleasure. So I really enjoy reading your Substack, which is very wide-ranging from a psychological perspective. It's called the Nature-Nurture-Nietzsche newsletter, which is a lot of N's. So let's start with a question of nature and nurture. This is a question that I know a lot of people are very interested in. Often without really knowing the latest research and so on. At 10,000 feet, to start off with that question, what is the best evidence today about the extent to which the most important human traits are caused by nature and the extent to which they are influenced by nurture?
All right, in at the deep end, great. I think there are basically two ways that you can tackle the nature-nurture issue. And one is the nature and nurture of individual differences between people, and the other is the nature and nurture of traits that we all have in common. And I guess a good example to pry those two apart would be that so basically everybody, all normally functioning human beings have the emotion of fear, for instance. And so the question would be, to what extent is that emotion a product of nature versus nurture? And then people differ, though, in their proneness to fear and how fearful they get in different situations. And then the nature-nurture question there would be, what explains the differences between people? And then the first question, I think, is best answered by evolutionary psychology, so applying evolutionary biological principles to human beings and the human mind. And the answer there might be, okay, we all have the emotion of fear because fear encourages certain kinds of behavior that on average are adaptive, so steering us clear of the edge of the cliff, for instance.
If you don't have, if you're not afraid at all, then you might tumble over the cliff or you might get eaten by the lion. And so over time, people who lack that faculty are not going to be able to pass on their genes.
Exactly, as are people who have that faculty too strongly as well. So there's a sort of happy medium somewhere in between the two. So that's the universals question. And then in terms of differences in fear, the field that would look at that would be behavior genetics. And that looks at the extent to which differences between individuals in traits like fear and any other trait you can measure, the extent to which those differences are correlated with differences among those individuals and the genetic variants that they have.
Great. And so the first one, there isn't really a nature versus nurture question. The first one is, what would be a human universal, something that all humans have, that is not influenced by evolutionary pressures in our biology? Are there examples of things that every human being has, but it is probably caused by nurture?
I would say that there are these days. So I think that it is a nature-nurture question, and maybe fear isn't the best example because I think that's a pretty obvious example where it is part of our nature. It is part of human nature that we have that emotion. Other faculties like language, for instance, I think it's less obvious. I do think that we are by nature a talking animal, but that's more of a debatable issue than is the case of fear. And as for the question of whether there are human universals, well, I guess part of the debate actually is for a given trait whether it is a human universal. And once you've established that it is,
once we believe it's a human universal, then we're going to be assuming that it has something to do with our nature.
Exactly.
And then people are going to go around saying, "But what about this tribe in some part of the Amazon that doesn't have a particular linguistic feature, or it doesn't have a particular other thing, and so then perhaps it's not actually part of our nature." Is that the idea?
No. Exactly right. But there are some things that probably would or could come quite close to being human universals that are not directly products of nature. Like I don't know. I can only think of joke examples off the top of my head, like drinking Coca-Cola and having smartphones and doom scrolling and eating pizza and things like that. Maybe a more serious example would be literacy, which isn't universal, but it's sort of close to universal in many nations, and you can sort of imagine that it could become a universal. And whereas I think spoken language, I think there's a good case to make that that's part of our nature, the capacity to learn a spoken language. I think reading and writing is a cultural invention instead, and one that could become a
That's interesting, right? So, there's universals that are in the realm of something like technology that obviously are not part of our nature, right? One way of thinking about reading or writing, one way of thinking about a smartphone, a T-shirt. Probably most human beings in the world own a T-shirt, and certainly not every human being, but most human beings, right? But that's because those are kind of technologies, and you might think that the things that allow us to produce those technologies are human universals. But the particular technology that we employ today, has to do with material culture and a particular stage of economic development, and the universality of Western cultural influence in the world, and other kinds of things that are much more contingent.
Yeah, and I see what you mean, and I think so. Maybe a better example would be something could be a universal that's in our minds, as opposed to T-shirts that we're wearing or technology that we're using. And I guess reading and writing, that is implemented in the brain. And so I think that probably would be the best example I can think of psychological trait that's nurture rather than nature that could become a universal.
That's very interesting, yeah. Before we move on to the very interesting question of differences between individuals, I know from a lot of people that they have these deep reservations against using evolutionary explanations for our nature today. In fact, I was teaching a chapter from one of my favorite books, certainly one of my favorite books in political psychology, The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, a number of months ago. And some of the students sort of rebelled against it a little bit and said, evolutionary biology is a discredited field. What they seem to have in mind, I think, is the fear that a certain kind of argument from evolutionary biology might commit them to political conclusions they don't like. Right? I mean, there might be people in the manosphere, for example, who say, it's in the nature of men to, want to sleep with as many women as possible, in the nature of women to want to find one man to commit to them, and therefore men should act like this and women should act like that, or something like that, right? And presumably the answer to those concerns is to say that you can point out certain traits that we have as humans universally, or certain differences between different groups of human beings, without thereby committing yourself in any way to a normative conclusion. So to those who may have this kind of skepticism about evolutionary biology, what would you say, first of all, to establish that, in fact, there are important insights to be gained from it, and secondly, perhaps to reassure them that they're not going to wind up getting committed to, for example, certain sexist views about, the right division of roles in society between men and women?
I think I'd start with the second part first, and just I would reiterate your point that I think that the descriptive differences that we might see between the sexes and other kind of things don't have any immediate political implications or ethical implications. To assume that they would is fallacy of reasoning known as the naturalistic fallacy. The idea that the fact that something is natural therefore means it's good. Also, I think people are unnerved by the prospect that if something is natural, that therefore means that it's inevitable and can't be changed. Both of which I think are wrong. I guess the first thing I would say actually is, even if that were true, so even if your worst fears were true, it doesn't actually mean that an evolutionary biological approach cannot shed light on human nature and human behavior, even if that were true. But I do think that it's not true. I do think that I guess two things. So one thing is, I think that a lot of the things that they worry about. So we're sort of starting to head into the territory of sex differences, which is where a lot of the misgivings come from. And I think that a lot of the differences are actually not as big. The claims about how large the sex differences are, they're not the kind of claims that people are worried about. The differences are often quite modest. There's a ton of overlap between the sexes in most traits where you have average differences. So that for a start. But people do notice the differences. And I think I would caution people that if we make it off limits to talk about these kind of things, then you're going to have more of a concern about people who think, okay, well, they're not talking about this, but there are obviously these differences between the sexes. Obviously, there's an innate kind of pushes in certain directions. So they're not telling us the truth. And I think that means it's more likely that the irresponsible people and the people who are lacking in nuance and talking about these kind of things are more likely to take that ball and run with it and draw inappropriate ethical conclusions from a garbled version of an evolutionary psychological perspective. as opposed to go ahead.
No, good.
Yeah, as opposed to if more responsible people with a more nuanced view, if they tackle it, then I think they're less likely to come to those dodgy conclusions.
Yeah, let me make 2 points here. One where I fully agree with you, and one where perhaps I'm not quite as sure that I agree with you. So
Sure.
I think there's this sort of strange fallacy of discourse control that pops up in big parts of our public intellectual life. I've written in the past about how journalists, I think, often overestimate the amount of influence they have over the views and the conclusions of their readers. And I think that one of the mistakes that many journalists have made over the last 10 years is to come to have the self-conception as wanting to save democracy. Now, I want to save democracy. I think that democracy is in peril and it's important to protect it. I think it's perfectly fine as a citizen to feel like one of your obligations is to do what you can to maintain this system of government. I think if journalists, particularly beat reporters, particularly journalists who are reporting on what's actually happening in the world, allow that ambition to influence what they write, they're actually going to be doing damage to that cause, because they think, for example, if I don't talk too much about the fact that Joe Biden seems to have some amount of mental decline and so on, then that's not going to give succor to Donald Trump. It's not going to make it easier for Trump to get reelected. What actually happens is that that's what ends up committing the Democratic Party to Biden for far too long, and they don't have time to have a real primary, and you end up with Trump getting reelected, right? So,
Exactly.
So there's all kinds of ways in which this desire to control the discourse ends up not working. What you actually mostly do is to convince people that they can't trust you, and therefore to turn to other sources of information, which are often less responsible and less accurate. So I completely agree with you on that if people can sense that there may be certain sex differences out in the world, and you say there's absolutely none, that might get us into difficult territory, you're not going to get the great enlightened policies you want at the end of this. You're just going to get people to mistrust you and possibly listen to people who have much more retrograde views. Now, I think there is perhaps, and I agree with you obviously on the naturalistic fallacy, that just to say that, something has a biological tendency doesn't mean that it's good or that we should encourage it or anything like that. But there may be an extent to which things that are hard-coded in our nature make it very difficult to change. So, for example, I believe that there are certain elements of human nature which make it very hard to live in fully communal living. And as a result, every time that people have tried to live in communes, and there's many examples of this now, Nicholas Christakis has written about this, for example, right? In very different cultural contexts, different time periods, different ideologies, different religious aspirations. It works for a little while at the beginning when the founders are there and everybody's super committed, and then it always goes wrong in very similar ways. And
Yep.
I think that does tell you, look, it might sound lovely to live in that kind of commune. It just ain't going to work. Now, perhaps some of it is true for sex differences as well. I mean, one of the famous studies is that, if you believe in a nurture account, I'm jumping ahead here a little bit to a different topic, of sex differences, right? If the reason why men are more likely to want to be engineers and women are more likely to want to be teachers, for example, is just, the cultural norms in that society. When you should think that the more egalitarian a society is, the more women are going to want to be engineers and the more men are going to want to be teachers. And what you actually find in a really fascinating international study is that in Norway and Sweden and other societies that may not be perfectly equal, where there may be some nurture effects nevertheless, but that are clearly among the most gender equal societies in the world, the difference in predilection for what professions people want is stronger than in some of the less gender equal societies, for example, in Iran or other parts of the Middle East, or societies in Africa and Asia that are much more traditional on a number of dimensions. So doesn't that mean that we do need to grapple a little bit with the fact that if our ideal is, which I don't think it needs to be, that 50% of engineers need to be women, then perhaps if some of those differences actually have a nature component, we're just not going to get there, and we kind of do have to give up on that ambition.
I do think we do have to grapple with it. I don't disagree with you there. I think that the fact that something has an evolutionary origin doesn't mean that it's necessarily unchangeable, but it does mean that it could be difficult to change, and it could mean that it's impossible to change, at least without draconian interventions that are more likely to do more harm than good. I think so. I think your comparison with journalists, not telling the truth, trying to get certain outcomes, I think is really apt here. I think the best policy for journalists and for scientists talking about these kind of issues is to tell the truth and to tell the whole truth and to do so carefully and responsibly, but to do that rather than trying to just put out the truth to try to accomplish a certain kind of aim. Because I think our best bet for making the world a better place is to have as accurate a picture of the world as we possibly can. I do agree, like I say though, I do agree that there may be limits. It may uncover limits to what we can do in terms of engineering the large-scale structure of society. And I'll say about that, first of all, even if that's true and that gives people misgivings about applying these ideas, it still could be true that is the case, and it is something that we should grapple with. And I think, that gender equality paradox and 50-50 in every, trying to get 50% men and 50% women in every field is an example of where we may find that we come up against limits to what we can do without really coercive practices. Because that gender equality paradox that you mentioned, it's quite a firm finding, and it's not just STEM fields, it's many different psychological traits. You do find that the prediction from a sort of social role perspective, a socialization perspective, would be that the more patriarchal a nation is, and the less gender equal it is, and the more men and women are treated differently and funneled into different social roles, you would anticipate that psychological sex differences would be larger in those countries. And in some cases they are, some cases there's no real association. But often, and very surprisingly, you do find the reverse, that the differences get larger in the more gender equal nations. Not completely sure why that is, but one possibility is that in societies that are more gender equal, they tend as well to be wealthier, more education, they're more individualistic. There's a whole cluster of traits that mean that people are more able to pursue what interests them most and nurture their own individuality. And when that happens, it does seem that one possible explanation is that certain inherent differences between individuals flourish more, and so too do certain average differences between the sexes. And
that seems
jobs,
that seems like an intuitive explanation. I mean, here's a kind of different example that might go in the same direction, right? To what extent is psychological predisposition going to influence the job choice among, number one, second-generation immigrants whose parents came to a country, let's say to the United States, from a much poorer country, and who, are smart and who have good high school degrees, etc., or B, among people who've been in the country for 150 years who come from a very affluent background. I would expect the psychological disposition of the WASP in this example to have a much greater influence on the job they choose, because they probably have the financial security and the knowledge of the society and all kinds of other things that make them say, if I want to go off and be a Broadway actor, I can afford to take the risk to try and do that, and I may know how to go and do something like that, which probably takes more cultural capital to succeed in, and so on and so forth, right? Versus the smart kid of immigrants who perhaps would also thrive on Broadway if they tried, but who's under a lot more pressure to go and do a secure, lucrative job. And that might also be more accessible because there's a more straightforward career path. You sort of know how to do that. They can take the risk more, and so you'd expect that with psychological predisposition that would make you go more towards more typical of Broadway actors than of investment bankers. The share among those of investment bankers with a recent immigrant background would be higher than among the members of a traditional society. And in a similar way, you might think the same is true for whether those, on average, differences in psychological disposition between men and women express themselves, right? In a relatively affluent society, very affluent society like Sweden or Norway, many more women might then take the risk to pursue careers that are true to their dispositions, whereas in a society that's much less affluent, they might simply go for the most prestigious job, or the job that's most likely to give them a decent income, even if that's not what they dream of doing.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think that's a big part of the explanation. I think also, though, it does seem to be that it's not just at a behavioural level, though, that you get the gender equality paradox. It does seem to be that personality traits and preferences and internal kind of stuff does also seem to magnify in more gender equal, wealthier, better educated, more individualistic societies, as well as just the behaviour.
Oh, that's very interesting. So it's not just that, in one society, people are more likely to want to do a certain kind of thing, to have that kind of predisposition, and then to act on it versus not act on it. It's that, in fact, the difference in basic preferences about what to do or how to relate to the world is bigger in more gender equal societies. That's more surprising. Yep. What could the explanation of that be?
Well, I mean, my best guess is that it is this phenomenon because people have more scope to pursue their own individuality. It just emerges and flourishes to a greater extent. I think that an analogy might be with height, for instance. So in wealthier societies, people are better fed, and so they grow bigger, but also individual differences get larger, average sex differences get larger, just because they have more of an opportunity to flourish, and so maybe that's analogous to what's going on psychologically with people as well.
Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah. So, I think we've inadvertently started to move into the second part of the nature-nurture debate, which is the differences between individuals. So tell us a little bit more about what we know about that in general. This is one interesting example we've been discussing in terms of gender equality paradox. When you look at differences in intelligence, in life outcomes, in predisposition, in psychological traits, in some of the most important things you can think of, what's our best evidence about what elements of the difference between you and me, between me and my brother, between you and your sister, I don't know if you have any brothers or sisters, is based on nature rather than nurture?
Well, the best evidence we have, we've got a ton of evidence from twin studies, adoption studies, and studies of twins adopted out at birth. And they paint a pretty clear message, at least in broad strokes, the message is quite clear, which is that almost any measurable trait, any trait that people differ on psychologically or physically, is partly due to genes, but not completely due to genes. And that is captured in, so that there's famous set of conclusions from this area. Behavior genetics is the name of the area. Famous set of conclusions, which are the 4 laws of behavior genetics. And the first law is that what I just said, basically that every trait is partially heritable, though not completely heritable. Typical estimates are, I guess, roughly 50-50. It spans from about 30% of differences are due to differences in genes to 70%, depending on the trait. Nowhere near close to 100% though. And I think the most intuitive way to grasp the fact that it's not completely down to genes is the fact that identical twins, if it were just down to genes, identical twins would be identical, literally, as opposed to just surprisingly similar, but never identical. So even traits like schizophrenia, for instance, if one member of an identical twin pair has schizophrenia, there's not a 100% chance that the other individual does as well. There's a 50% chance. Yeah,
that's very interesting. Tell us a little bit more what exactly twin studies do, right? So the idea presumably is that you look at people where the genetic is held constant, which obviously is not between siblings, because even though you come from the same parents, if you're full siblings, there's going to be some random variation in which genes you inherit and which express themselves, and so you're only about 50% equal. But with identical twins, you are going to be fully equal. So then presumably you look to some extent at identical twins within the same families, but particularly when that is possible, at identical twins who have been raised in quite different families from each other.
Yeah, and that's the sort of gold standard study, is we have identical twins reared separately. That's the best example. A lot of the comparisons, though, come from comparing identical twins with fraternal twins. And if you have enough of them, so you're right that with the fraternal twins, the average is 50%, but it can be more or less. But if you have a sufficiently large sample, and often they do have very large samples for these studies, the average is close enough to 50 that you can get a close approximation that basically you doubled the level of genetic similarity with the identical twins as compared to the fraternal twins.
And it turns out, does it, that the identical twins actually have much more similar life outcomes than the fraternal twins. And here, obviously, what they're doing is to hold constant on the same environment, because not only are they growing up in the same family, they're growing up in the same family at the same time, right? Whereas with siblings, it might be that there's some event that happens, in the 3 or 5 years before the younger sibling is born, where the family gets much richer or much poorer, or there's some psychological trauma. You're mostly ruling that out once you have those fraternal twins or identical twins.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so fraternal twins, I think, do tend to be somewhat more similar because of that. There's no cohort effect. They are at the exact same age. Somewhat more similar than regular siblings who are born at different times. But identical twins are like a lot more similar than fraternal twins. So one question people raise, they say, okay, well, maybe is that because if they're reared in the same home, maybe people just treat identical twins more similarly to each other than they treat fraternal twins for some reason. And so you can measure that, and typically they don't treat them much more similar anyway. But in any case, you can get around that by you can look at identical twins who are reared apart, and and you can just compare those identical twins reared together or fraternal twins reared apart or together. And even when they're reared apart, identical twins are notably more similar than two randomly chosen people of the same age, or fraternal twins reared apart, or you name it. Yeah,
and to give us a little bit of a sense of the sort of magnitude of these outcomes, right? So, how much more similar are identical twins compared to fraternal twins? Or, different question, when you take these identical twins and they do end up getting reared apart, how similar or different do the life outcomes end up being?
So take a trait like IQ, for instance. If you look at you calculate the heritability level of that trait in childhood, early childhood, 5, 6, that kind of age, it's maybe 20% heritable, and there's a notable effect of growing up together in the same home. So two individuals growing up in the same home, they're more similar than they would be if they'd grown up separately in early childhood. But then one of the very counterintuitive findings from behavior genetics is that as kids get older, the heritability of IQ actually goes up, rather than you might expect that it would go down as people have more experience and more nurture. But it doesn't. It goes up. And so by early adulthood, a typical kind of estimate might be about 0.5. So the heritability level, in other words, is 0.5. So 50% of the differences among individuals in terms of their IQ scores are due to genes, and the rest is due to experience and non-genetic factors. Interestingly, though, the effect of the shared family environment, so the level of similarity caused by growing up together, that wears off as people get older. So even though it's not all due to genes when people are adults, but within the normal range of family homes, almost all the similarity between siblings, including twins, is due to genes rather than the shared environment. And identical twins who are reared apart are basically as similar in IQ and many traits, actually. They're as similar as identical twins reared together. So that the identical twins reared together are not much more similar by adulthood than the identical twins reared apart, even though it's not all down to genes.
So unpack that for me a little bit, right? Because if you're saying that something like 50% of the heritability comes down to genes, then I would expect that at the age of 30 or 40, there would still be some very significant differences between them. But what you're saying is that the older they get, the more similar they end up becoming, and somehow even the similarity that seems to be down to growing up in the same household appears to have this genetic component. So help me puzzle through this, because these two things seem to pull in slightly different directions, right?
It is. It's an odd finding, right? It's a surprising finding. They do become more similar as they get older. They're not completely similar though, and it seems that by adulthood, the similarity is largely due to shared genes. and the environmental contribution seems to be largely to create the differences between them. Whereas bizarrely, the environment doesn't seem to, like sharing an environment, growing up together, doesn't seem to make people much more similar than they would be otherwise. And people often, when they hear that, they think that sounds like the claim is that it's all down to genes. But it's not, because identical twins are not literally identical. It just means that the environment, whatever it is in the environment that's shaping people, it seems to make them different from each other much more readily and easily than it makes them similar to each other. Whereas the similarity seems to come mainly from the shared genes. Surprising, right?
So let me try and puzzle through this, because I'm not sure I fully grasp it right now. So let's take two 50-year-old identical twins who have exactly the same level of IQ. That's not always going to be the case, of course, but in this particular case, it's stipulated that it happens to be true.
Sure.
Right? There you're saying the reason why they're so similar is their genes, particularly if they were reared apart. Now let's look at two 50-year-old identical twins that were reared apart, and they have a significant difference in IQ. Let's say that one of them has an IQ of 110 and one of them has an IQ of 90, which is a significant difference, right? And you're saying, well, that's likely, if that is the case, that is likely to be the case because they grew up in vastly different environments. Perhaps one of them grew up in an environment that really maximized the opportunities of his child and gave him access to all kinds of developmentally appropriate learning materials, etc. And perhaps the other one, had some amount of genuine food deprivation or some, significant influence on the development that really meant that they weren't able to reach their full potential. Is that getting in the right direction?
It is. It's tricky though, because when you're talking about heritability, you're talking about it applies to groups of individuals rather than specific pairs of individuals. So if you have identical twins who have the same IQ, the fact that it's exactly the same may or may not be due to nature or nurture. It could be in that particular case, it could be something different. It could be more due to nature, more due to nurture. One of them might have had an accident, had a head injury or something like that. That maybe one individual was smarter and then had a head injury that took him to the same level. So it applies to groups of individuals, and it would be that if the average, how can I put it? That if among a group of people, the correlation between IQ, say, is 0.7 in a group of identical twins. To what extent is that due to genes, that 0.7 correlation? And it's about 50% due to genes, 50% due to other stuff. In terms, though, of things that environmental factors that change IQ, I think the ones that you're suggesting are very plausible candidates for things that could affect individuals' IQs. I think serious kind of things like food deprivation, opportunities as well. And so actually, and I should say, so that what I'm talking about now in terms of the effect of the shared environment, that's called the second law of behavior genetics. And that's the idea that the effect of the shared environment is much smaller than the effect of genes. And sometimes there's no effect at all. Growing up together doesn't make you any more similar than you would otherwise be. So that's the second law of behavior genetics. And it's worth pointing out that mainly seems to apply. It mainly seems to apply when it comes to just within the normal range. So the kind of normal range where people have, decent opportunities, they're fed well, and the like. And I think outside that range, all bets are off. If people are being abused, suffering food deprivation, total lack of opportunities, that's certainly going to have an effect. But, yeah.
And is that lopsided because you're talking about outside the normal range, and then all of the examples you gave are negative, right? Which is to say, are the exceptions mostly in the direction of, once you've cleared a certain minimal threshold, you're within the normal range. But if you have, if you have a child of a billionaire, and you have all of the possible opportunities, that doesn't make that big of a difference? Or is that similar, right? Is it sort of, on the one side, if you have food deprivation, that's obviously going to ding your IQ a lot. On the other side, if you have all the best tutors in the world, it's going to go up a lot? Or it's only on the downside? It's only on the risk side that makes a big difference?
I think, unfortunately, it's mainly on the downside that you have a big difference. You get diminishing returns. It just seems to be a lot easier to throw development off course than to massively increase it. Yeah.
So how I had on the podcast recently Emily Oster, who's a great economist, thinking about some questions about parenting and so on, and I would love to get your feedback on one kind of stylized takeaway that I had from that conversation, right? Which was, roughly speaking, that the impacts of parenting tend to be much smaller than people realize. That they agonize about, how much screen time children are going to have, about whether they can afford to sign the kid up for that extra ballet class, whether they're being a bad parent if they don't engage with their kid for an extra half an hour at night because they're tired that day, etc. Right? But roughly speaking, in the studies that she's looking at, these things really don't make much of a difference. Now, she doesn't get into the nature-nurture debate, right? But you might sort of speak to it from either perspective. But, a huge part of a development is just predetermined by genes. Even, identical twins raised in completely different households are going to end up having pretty similar results. So what you do in your household is not going to matter that much. And B, to the extent that household matters, it's really going to be at the extremes. So if you are, a loving parent who's able to provide your child with basic sustenance, if you make sure, which is hard enough, that they're not going to get some horrible trauma in their childhood, that they're not going to starve and all of those things, you really should relax. Don't worry so much about it. Your choice about the extra ballet class or this school or how much screen time to give them, it's just not going to make a big difference. That's, again, Emily might have quibbles with how I presented this, but that was my personal takeaway from the conversation. Would you roughly second this, or do you have quibbles about that picture?
No, I would definitely second that. I think that is definitely what the second law of behavior genetics, all the evidence for that, I think, is pointing that direction. Which is that within the normal range, little differences in parenting philosophy and the number of books that you have on the bookshelf and screen time and time that you spend with your kid, all of that kind of stuff does seem to have surprisingly little impact. And so in principle, I think that, parents should chill out a bit. So there's a good implication from that. And I'm pretty persuaded by that. I'm quite strongly persuaded by that, and agree with the implication that you should chill out. I certainly, with my own kids, though, even knowing that, I still found that I would agonize about those things, and little differences I would think about a lot. So it's easier said than done, I think. But I do think that is, I think she's right, and I think the implication is true as well.
It's particularly easier said than done if, like in my own case, one doesn't have children.
Yeah, right, indeed. I guess the only thing I'd add is that I think that the fact that it doesn't make a big difference isn't because it's all just down to genes. I think that it's partly because genes have a bigger impact than people think, but I think it's also partly just because we don't have a particularly accurate picture of exactly what it is in the environment that does shape people. Because the environment is having a big impact, but I just don't think things like half an hour versus an hour of screen time or the extra ballet class are among the environmental things that make a difference. And I think we have less of an idea about what does make a difference than we sometimes think that we have.
Well, and presumably, the genes, by the time a baby is born, are set in stone. Yeah. A lot of the environment is also set in stone, right? You're going to be a parent in 2025, in whatever country you live in, at a certain socioeconomic status, with a certain set of personality traits. And any sort of choice you make within that is just going to make a very, very marginal difference to those basic background conditions.
That's very true. Yeah, I completely agree. And actually, I do think the country that you're born into does seem to have a big difference. So the economist Brian Kaplan has argued that quite a bit. So within a given country, within a given socioeconomic sphere, we don't have a huge idea what the environmental contributions are. But we do know that moving, for instance, from a poor country to a rich country has a huge impact on kids' life outcomes. And all the odds are that they're going to do a lot better in the wealthier country than they would have if their family had not moved and they'd grown up in the poorer country.
That's very interesting. And what kind of life outcomes are we talking about here? Obviously, it's unsurprising that they might end up making a lot more money over the course of their lives because they're just in a context where even a similar kind of job is going to command a much, much higher wage. Is that also true, for example, for the kind of IQ we're going to have, or the kind of psychological traits we're going to have, or other kinds of things where that might be a little bit more surprising. Because again, the wage level is sort of, that just seems definitionally true, right? You're a teacher in Malaysia today, or you're a teacher in the United States today. You're just going to earn a lot more money in the United States, even for presumably a similar level of skill and predisposition, right? So people with similar levels of skill and personality might end up being teachers in Malaysia or the United States. You're just going to earn a lot more in the United States. It's a much richer economy. But is it also true for those other kinds of things where that is sort of more surprising?
It's a great question, and I'm not completely sure of the answer. I think, like with IQ, I'm not so sure. With education, I believe that it's elevated. Health, I think, is elevated. But in terms of other surprising things, I'm not actually sure.
So we've talked about two laws of, I believe you call it population genetics.
Behavior genetics. Yeah.
Okay, let me do this again.
Yeah.
So we've talked about two laws of behavior genetics. I believe you said there's four laws. Are there laws 3 and 4 that we need to cover before we move on to the next topic?
We could do briefly. So the third law of behavior genetics is kind of the flip side of the second one. So the second one is that the shared family environment doesn't have a particularly big impact. And then the third law of behavior genetics is that there's a lot of variation left over that's not explained by genes or explained by the shared family environment. So there's what's called the non-shared environment, which is something that is the environmental contribution that shapes individuals over and above genes and growing up together. And not completely sure what that is. The interesting finding there, though, is that it's been argued pretty persuasively, I think, that just random chance and random noise in development is a bigger part of what shapes who we are than we might want to think or than we might intuitively think. So a lot of the differences between us, a lot of it's due to genes, a little bit due to the family environment that we grow up in, and then a not trivial amount is just due to random developmental noise, especially early on.
And what kind of random developmental noise might that be? An interesting study popped in my mind when you said that, which is that younger siblings tend to have somewhat lower IQs than older siblings. And again, you might think that's about nurture, that perhaps parents should somehow spend more time with or invest more resources into older siblings. I read a recent study or came across a recent study which seemed to suggest that perhaps older siblings are more likely to pick up colds and other kinds of mild viral diseases that they might then pass on to their younger siblings, and that perhaps that creates enough developmental noise to ding the IQ of those younger siblings, but 2 or 3 percentage points. The statistical difference isn't huge. But that perhaps that kind of random thing, which is at some crucial developmental stage, they happen to have a flu for a couple of weeks, and that somehow dings them by a couple of IQ points in a lasting way. What kind of when we're talking about random noise like that, what kind of factor are we talking about? Is it that kind of thing? Is it whether you happen to have gotten the flu at 18 months of age?
Yeah, it is that. So I think that's a really interesting idea, by the way. That's quite fascinating. They're more likely to get the flu or something like that at a younger age than their older siblings would have been. But that would be systematic. In that case, that would be systematic because there's an increased chance that the younger sibling is going to be in that situation.
Right, and therefore it explains the systematic difference in IQ between older and younger siblings.
Yeah, exactly right. But nonetheless, if you do happen to breathe in a flu virus versus not breathe in a flu virus at a certain age, that's basically random. That's as random as getting struck by lightning. But it could have that effect. So that is the sort of thing. One way I think Steven Pinker put it in one of his books that a neuron and setting up the brain, a neuron zigs rather than zags for no particular reason. There are billions of neurons in the brain, and exactly what they do isn't controlled by. We've got 20,000-ish genes, so it can't all be controlled by those. So there's just some randomness in them. Flu, random accidents. Somebody happens to slip and ding their head, bump their head, for no particular reason, unrelated to personality traits or risk proneness. Those would be the kind of things. Accidental stuff.
Earlier the message was don't worry too much about what you're doing because the basic life outcomes of your children are set in stone. Now I feel like people could latch onto this part of a conversation and say, oh my God, I mean, whether or not my toddler falls over and bangs their head one more time could make this huge difference in whether they get into an Ivy League school or not, or whatever it is that your dreams of a kid might be.
Yeah. And true, and they might get a lot more worried about early life flus and keeping people away from that. That is tricky. That is tricky, and I'm not sure what to say about that. I would say that the difference that started us down this track, like you mentioned, it's a small difference, right? That IQ difference. I don't know. I guess a couple of points is a big difference. I mean, I guess I guess possibly there are some things that have a bigger impact than others, and I guess maybe the conclusion is that a lot of the stuff that we think has an impact doesn't, but maybe there are other things that do have a somewhat bigger difference. Like whether you contract a flu virus early on and accidents and the like. I'm not sure actually. I don't want to fully endorse what I just said. So I think there are differences in the size of the impact and the scale of the impact of different things. But actually, I think one meta lesson from psychology is that pretty much nothing has a huge impact. So psychology is quite tricky, I think, in the fact that the vast majority of influences on us have really, really a tiny impact, but there are just lots of them.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so if it's not enough to get the flu, you have to get the flu and to get dinged on your head and 7 other things.
Yep.
And then perhaps you'll go to a university that's a little bit less selective, which might not make you a less productive or happy person either. So,
Indeed.
We can still, if you want to tell parents to relax, you can always find reasons to relax them. But I feel like this is going to have made people a little bit more nervous. I believe we've now covered 3 of the 4 laws. What is the 4th law of behavioral genetics?
Yeah, the 4th law is the fact that complex traits are never due just to 1 gene or 2 genes or even half a dozen or a dozen genes. They're almost always due to hundreds or even thousands of genetic variants, each of which has only a tiny, tiny impact. But collectively, they have a pretty big impact, accounting for the heritability of the traits. But that's not just due to 1 gene or a couple. Like maybe 10, 20 years ago, you would see a lot of headlines that would say, okay, we've discovered an IQ gene or a gay gene or a warrior gene, longevity gene, etc., etc., etc. And the vast majority of those have failed to replicate. So they were false positives due to studies that had samples that were too small, basically. But what does seem to be replicating now is that just hundreds of thousands of genes contribute to almost every complex trait that you care to name.
So what you're trying to tell me is that my biology teacher lied to me when they talked about a nice simple example of a dominant gene and a recessive gene, and if my child gets the recessive gene from me and the recessive gene from the mom, then that's presumably true for certain diseases or for certain kind of conditions, but for most of the most interesting character traits, that's not going to be the case.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So it is true. Eye color and things like that. Eye color, that dominance model does work, but most genetic effects don't work like that. They're additive rather than having that dominance recessive structure.
So much for Mendel. Poor Mendel. We've been using the concept of IQ on and off in this conversation, and I know that is another concept that people who don't know the scientific literature well are often quite confused about, right? On the one hand, there's a popular fascination with IQ tests and the importance of IQ. On the other hand, there's quite a lot of skepticism about the idea that these strange tests where you're supposed to look at these patterns and guess which next pattern is the logical continuation, and the number that they give you really have a meaningful predictive capacity about the world or capture some really meaningful difference in intelligence between different people. What are the psychological findings about, first of all, how predictive IQ is of different kinds of life outcomes and other things that we might want to care about?
Yeah, well, it is surprisingly predictive. It's only one factor among many, but it is surprisingly predictive. I do get the intuition it does seem bizarre, right? That doing a whole bunch of little quirky little tests could give you one number that would predict lots of stuff. It does seem a little implausible on its face, but it does seem to do it. It does seem that, like just for a start, and maybe least surprising, is that it does predict how well people do in education. And so that does sound like, at first glance, that seems unsurprising. But then I think it is a little bit surprising that a single number does a reasonable job of predicting how people are going to do across all their different school subjects. You could easily imagine that it wouldn't come out like that you would need several different numbers and you would need different numbers for different subjects, but actually it does seem that one number does a reasonable job of predicting.
Right, it's not obvious. I mean, it may perhaps be obvious why looking at this set of patterns and being able to predict, what the next logical step in the sequence is might make you good at math. Not exactly the same activity, but sort of related. It's harder to see why it would, make you, predict whether or not you're good at writing an essay about history. But you're saying
Exactly.
that empirically it just turns out to be true.
Exactly right. Yeah. That is education, but it also does predict other life outcomes further down the track. So it predicts career success, job success. It predicts income. It predicts longevity. It predicts things like it predicts health. It predicts mental health. So basically, contrary to the stereotype, higher IQ is statistically associated with lower rates of most mental illnesses. Possibly anorexia is an exception to that rule, but for the most part, you look at the curves, rates of mental illness come down as IQ is going up. Those are some of the main ones, and those are all quite. Those are things that really matter to people, right? Like how well you do at your job really matters to people. How long you live really matters to people. Health and mental health. It's predicting really important stuff, not just quirky, random stuff that doesn't matter too much in the real world.
One of the ways in which that runs up against my intuition from real life is that, I can see how all kinds of intellectual skills might be related. But there's also ways in which people who, are genuinely pretty smart are really bad at other things. I'm thinking of an acquaintance of mine who is, literally a legendary figure in one field of mental activity. People might be able to guess who I have in mind, who it turns out has a terrible sense of orientation. I mean, you try to meet up with him on some street corner of New York, and he will be standing at the wrong street corner. Right. I don't want to compare myself to that person in any way, but I think I'm, good at some things intellectually. I'm not the stupidest person in the world, and I'm generally good at various kinds of things. Right. I have mild face blindness. Right.
Interesting.
I'm just so I'm not formally diagnosed, but I've taken online tests, provided by various universities, etc., and I'm in, I think, the 6th percentile of the population for my ability to recognize faces. Not disastrous, not one of those cases like Oliver Sacks who wouldn't recognize their own mom out of context, but certainly we're looking at each other as we're having this conversation. If you sat next to me in the subway tomorrow and said hi to me out of context, I would have no idea who you are. Right?
Interesting.
So how do those two findings go together? Right? If IQ is generally sort of suggestive of all of these different kinds of things, why is it nevertheless that people who clearly seem to be pretty good at a lot of mental activities can then have other kind of mental activities at which they're just terrible?
It's interesting, isn't it? It's really interesting. I think with the face blindness one, that is less surprising. I've seen research suggesting that people's facial recognition abilities are pretty much separate from IQ. It does seem to be a kind of separate function implemented in the brain in some way that seems to be separate from however general intelligence is implemented. The spatial one is more surprising, I guess, and less common as well. So I think it's just less common to have massive discrepancies between different faculties that make up IQ. And spatial abilities are part of, that they do correlate with IQ. I would say, like, first of all, so with IQ, even though it is just one number, and it's a pretty useful number. Within that, there are different cognitive abilities, and it's not the case that everybody has the same level of those abilities. So everybody has strengths and weaknesses, and one of the one of the reasons that IQ isn't everything is the fact that it does obscure those strengths and weaknesses. And yeah, it is interesting that you can have such a big discrepancy. It does seem you can. Yeah, I don't know really what else to say about that, but there is variability, and I guess there's variability among individuals in terms of how much, the extent to which you have those discrepancies, and then at the tails, you're just going to have a small number of people who just have very, very large discrepancies.
Yeah, and I suppose the other thing to say about it is that it's one thing for it to be strongly correlated. That doesn't mean that in each individual all of those things will be correlated, right? And it may be true for a lot of the people, that I'm thinking of, that, in fact, that general cognitive skill is correlated in such a way that in 9 out of 10 tasks are really good. There's always going to be 1 out of 10 tasks where they happen to be somewhat less good, and perhaps that's if you modeled that presumably into 10 different faculties, you would still end up with a very strong statistical correlation, even if on 1 of the 10 they're not very good. What would be your best parsimonious model of trying to predict life success? So you've made a strong case that IQ goes into that, right? That high IQ predicts life success, and that perhaps to have extraordinary success at some field of endeavor, you really do have to have a high level of IQ. Presumably, there's other things that go into that as well. So when I think of people who might have a high level of IQ but who haven't turned out to be very successful, usually either they're really lacking in some form of self-control, or perhaps they really have particularly strong mental health challenges, or they really are lacking in some form of social facility. They're really lacking in an ability to cooperate with people. There's sort of like a few other things that I would intuitively throw in where, you have to have at least a kind of minimum threshold of competence at those other things.
Yep.
In order to maximize your chance of success. What would you say, if you're designing a character in a sim game to see whether or not they're going to be successful, what qualities would you be trying to double click on to make sure that they have a certain level to guarantee that overall success?
Yeah, well, definitely not just IQ. So you're absolutely right. So, I think some people become kind of IQ fanatics and kind of seem to put everything on IQ, and it's certainly not the only factor. Personality as well comes into it, and it is interesting that a lot of the traits that you mentioned, I'm thinking about the literature on the Big Five and how the Big Five predicts life outcomes as well, and a lot of the traits that you mentioned.
The Big Five being the Big Five personality traits, sometimes known as the ocean test. So openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Exactly. And what is it, I think? Is it conscientiousness and neuroticism that are particularly predictive?
Yes. So conscientiousness is the most predictive of the Big Five. And so IQ, of all these traits, IQ is the single best predictor, followed by conscientiousness. And that would embrace traits like that you mentioned, like self-control. Neuroticism is the next one after that, and that's a negative predictor of many life outcomes. It's a weaker predictor than conscientiousness, though, and in turn weaker than IQ. Agreeableness would capture some of the inability to cooperate, inability to get on with people, people who score very low on that, who are highly disagreeable. That would come under that, I think, perhaps. Mental health. Sort of separate, I guess. Some of mental health is captured by extreme neuroticism, so depression and anxiety and the like. That wouldn't capture things like schizophrenia and other severe debilitating things. So I guess I would put so IQ first, and you'd want a pretty decent minimum threshold of that, followed by conscientiousness, followed by neuroticism, agreeableness, openness. And what's the one that I'm missing out on? Agreeableness, openness, and extroversion. Extroversion. Yeah. They're less predictive, but they are as well predictive. Extroversion tends to be associated with better outcomes in a lot of ways, job outcomes, for instance. and then low on the mental health. So severe mental health problems are extremely debilitating, right?
Right. And what about this idea that I kind of threw in there, but I hadn't quite thought through, as I said that, which is that I guess my intuition is you can certainly be very intelligent and not successful in life. And there's all of those examples of, general leaders in life who are always going on about how the members of Mensa, the organization, deserve particularly intelligent people, etc. And that presumably is because even if you have a high IQ, there's all kinds of things that can throw you off a course of success, including random chance and so on, but also, a lack of conscientiousness, a lack of agreeableness, a lack of these other kinds of things that are necessary. What about the inverse claim that I sort of threw in there, which is that when you look at the people who are particularly successful in the world, whether you look at inventors, whether you look at writers, whether you look at musicians, whether you look perhaps at athletes, that you need to have certainly a minimum threshold of IQ and perhaps a high level of IQ in order to have this special level of achievement in life. Is that true, or do you think that somebody with an IQ of 100 or perhaps with an IQ of 90 can still have a real chance, not just of holding down a good job and having a decent life and having a meaningful existence on Earth, but really of making the mark with some extraordinary level of achievement?
That's a good question. I think I want to answer it statistically, I think. And I think that perhaps they do, but just the further down that scale you go, I think it just becomes less likely. I think possibly there's a minimum threshold for a lot of forms of achievement, where it gets close to zero at a certain point if you go far enough down the scale. But zero chance of massive achievement. I wouldn't want to hazard a guess as to exactly where that is. But I want to double click on your point about how further down, I think that it's perfectly possible to have a meaningful life and a good life and a life where you're contributing something to the world. Just extreme accomplishment is a different story. And I guess the thing is, if talking about extreme accomplishment, only a small number of even people with very high IQs have extreme levels of accomplishment.
Of course, but I know there's studies on that. But let's say we took the CEOs of S&P 500 companies, right?
Yeah.
I know from conversations with people that I think there's really widely varying intuitions about what percentage of that group would have ordinary IQs. And I think there's a lot of my friends who would say, oh, I bet that a half of them or a quarter of them have an IQ of 100. I mean, others would say, no, I bet that, perhaps one or two somehow inherited a company or some weird kind of circumstance have an IQ below 110 or perhaps below 120. But really the vast majority of them would have, IQ in a rare range, above 120, above 130, something like that. Do you have a sense from the literature of which of these two kind of claims is more likely to be right?
I do. I think that second group of people would win that bet. So there's research, for instance, by Jonathan Y, and he has found, he's looked at CEO IQ levels, and they do tend to be very high.
And one thing that strikes me as interesting here, and I'm going to make some assumptions about listeners to this podcast, but I think it's an assumption that probably is justified, which is that it's probably people who seek out quite intellectual content and have a real interest in that, which certainly means they have probably openness to experience and other kind of psychological traits, but probably also means that on average they have a higher than average IQ. And what I'm struck by, certainly in my social milieu, is that, in a place like the United States in particular, it's a society that's incredibly stratified, probably much more stratified than most in the history of mankind by IQ level, right? I mean, to get into a good college, you have to do well on the SAT. The SAT is basically an IQ test, et cetera, et cetera. And so it always strikes me that when people in my social milieu, and again, I recognize I'm saying something about my own social circle here, sort of say, oh, this person is kind of stupid, look, they're successful and they're kind of stupid. We're talking about people who to them seem rightly or wrongly, fairly or unfairly, strikingly unintelligent within a group that is highly, extremely selected on IQ. And so that the people who they would describe as being of ordinary intelligence may in fact still have quite unusually high IQ relative to the average or to the median of a population.
That seems entirely plausible to me. Yeah.
I want to change topics a little bit and ask you about politics. And I'm not going to ask you about Donald Trump or Narendra Modi or anything like that. But, what do we learn from psychology about how we as the human species engage in politics? How has evolution, how have our basic psychological traits shaped how we behave in terms of tribalism, in terms of assessing evidence, in terms of who is drawn to more extreme ideologies, and so on?
I think quite a lot. I think there's a lot of very interesting research that's been emerging in the last decade or so from the field of political psychology. And I think the first thing that comes to mind when you ask that question is, I think one aspect of human nature that I think really permeates our political behavior and our political thinking is our in-group, out-group biases and what I think is a built-in tendency to kind of divide the world into us and them, in-groups and out-groups, friends and enemies and the like. And I think that, especially in the last decade or so, that general tendency that we have has been amped up. We see it today on steroids as we become more and more politically polarized. And I don't know, as soon as you have that in-group, out-group kind of bias at play, it does seem that a bunch of psychological biases that we have come into play as well. Where we are likely to discount the views of the people in the out-group. We're likely to see them as being much more extreme than they actually are. Some very interesting research on that suggesting that the main reason that members of different political affiliations dislike each other and hate each other is the views that most of the other party doesn't actually hold. So the extreme kind of views that are found among a minority are attributed to the majority when you're talking about the out-group, and so we end up hating them for views that don't actually hold.
Tell me a little bit more about that. I know of some specific studies arguing that in the American context. So More in Common, for example, has some great studies showing that Democrats think, when it comes to views of American history, that most Republicans don't want the history of slavery to be taught in schools, and things like that. And Republicans think that most Democrats, aren't patriotic and don't think that George Washington was a positive figure in American history. And it turns out that while there are, of course, some Republicans who don't want slavery to be taught in schools and some Democrats who think that George Washington was an evil man, those are really minority positions within each of those political groups. That most Democrats are perfectly comfortable with teaching the great things that George Washington did, even though they also want to acknowledge, his role in slavery, and that most Republicans, don't want America to be defined just by the fact that slavery played an important role in the country's history, but they absolutely do want slavery to be taught in history. So I know that from a specific context like that, but is there some research which suggests that that is a kind of more general tendency that you see across political contexts?
I have a strong hunch that it is a general tendency, but unfortunately a lot of the research that has been done on this topic has been done in the US. And with this exact tendency, this attributing the extreme views to the majority for the other group, as far as I'm aware, that has only been done in the US. I definitely would put my money on the fact, though, that is a cross-cultural, pan-human tendency. It's an interesting one. It's a very important one, I think, and one reason. So there are a couple of reasons why it gets set in stone, and why people don't have their false perceptions about these issues corrected. And one is that because people attribute these extreme views to the other party, that makes them disinclined to want to interact with members of the other party. They don't want to shake their hands. They don't want to talk to them, let alone have them as friends or the like, which is a surefire way to make sure that they're not going to have their false perceptions about the other members of the other party corrected. And also on top of that, people seem reluctant to challenge the extreme views of their own party. Among the minority who hold the extreme views in their own party, they're much happier to express their agreement with the moderate views of their own party than their disagreement with the extreme views, which does really open up the possibility that members of the other party, they're going to see that, they're going to see, okay, there are these people over there, they're expressing these extreme views, whether it's abolish schools on the right-hand side of the political spectrum, or abolish the police on the other, and no one seems to be piping up and saying, no, we shouldn't do that. So maybe this view is not rare at all. Maybe it's quite commonly held on the other side. Can lock people into that view.
But those are interesting mechanisms. I wonder whether there's a way of reframing the question, which is just an additional mechanism, which is that there's an apparent puzzle here. Why is it that we misperceive the world? And in general, of course, there's good benefits to perceiving the world accurately. So it's always in need of explanation when we perceive the world inaccurately. But that assumes that we want to encounter the outgroup, read them accurately, potentially come to a more positive opinion of them. And I wonder whether in some ways we're so wired to prefer the in-group to the out-group, to divide the world into my tribe and everybody else, that a lot of the function of society is to counteract that tendency. A lot of what we're taught in schools, when schools don't go off the rails, a lot of what patriotism in particularly diverse societies is meant to do. A lot of what good institutions in our society are trying to encourage is to go against the grain, is to tell me, oh, hang on a second, this person who seems like we're part of another group is actually part of this broader group that we share. And so perhaps the reason why we tend to exaggerate the extremism of these others is that it's very comforting, because it's what allows us to revert back to our in-group bias. It's what allows us to say, oh, I know my teacher says I'm supposed to like that person, but you know what? They're this extreme, dangerous person with terrible views, and so I get to indulge in the thing that I'm being driven towards by my nature anyway, and there's a kind of satisfaction to that.
Yeah, I'm sure that's right. I think there is a satisfaction to it, and I think that one of the problems and one of the causes of the increase in polarization is the fact that a lot of media are indulging that passion that we have for hating the outgroup. So you have Fox on one side, you have MSNBC or whatever else on the other side, Fox and the like, that indulge that, and people enjoy that, and I think that is one of the things that's contributing to this, is the rise of clickbait culture within media.
What do we know about what psychological traits might make people more likely to be extremists? Whether we're talking about the most extreme kind of extremists, like terrorists or revolutionaries, or whether we're talking, more run-of-the-mill extremists, just people with, particularly polarized political views, with particular likelihood to dislike the other political party, to take, very extreme views within, say, the U.S. political system.
Yeah, we do know some stuff about that. I have a Substack post on that topic, and there's a list of traits that do seem to predict extremism. Let's see if I can recall them off the top of my head. So one of them certainly is cognitive simplicity. So a lot of folks who are attracted to the extremes, they tend to think about things in quite simplistic terms, black and white terms, good and evil kind of terms, and the like, and that puts them into that ballpark. Cognitive simplicity. Now, let me see what are the other ones. Psychological distress. Psychological distress seems to be another one that differentiates extremists from moderates, is that they're more prone to psychological distress, and that seems to attract them to more extreme kind of views. Overconfidence in their views is another one. And I think that probably falls out of the cognitive simplicity. Like if you see the world in quite simple terms, and the good guys and bad guys, that's a quite simple, easy to understand view, and with a simple kind of view, it's easier to be more overconfident in a simple view. If you have a more nuanced kind of view, I think that
If a world is divided into good and bad guys, then obviously the bad guys can't be right.
exactly, yeah, exactly right. Whereas if it's shades of grey, then it becomes easier to think, yeah, to be less confident in your views. And then the last one is intolerance. Seems to be a trait that differentiates the extremist from the moderates. They seem to be less tolerant, and I think all of these tie together, because I think that as well ties in with the fact that if you have a simple view of the world, and you've got your good guys and you've got your bad guys, and it's very, very clear who the bad guys are, well, it's very, very clear that it's appropriate to be intolerant of those individuals.
Yeah, if the people who have a different view from you just have different beliefs about how to accomplish good outcomes in the world, or perhaps have slightly different values from you, but in ways that are understandable because they come from a slightly different moral tradition, which itself has its own dignity, then you're going to be drawn towards tolerance for them. If your view of the world is, I'm on the side of the righteous and the good, and the right answers are really damn simple, and if you don't come to the right answer, it must be either that you're an idiot or just that you're evil. Well, why tolerate these evil idiots who are not on board with how I would make the world a better place?
Yeah, exactly. So it does make an intuitive sense, I think, doesn't it? And I think, I don't know, I think probably it's easy to see how people could fall into the trap of wanting to see the world as good and evil. And I think that's another example of what you're talking about, where it would be very good in a thriving democracy to have an education system and a general cultural tradition that does try to push people away from those natural vulnerabilities in human nature.
I have a final question for you, or perhaps a final set of questions, which is that everything you've talked about is fascinating, and I think that in general, people who think about politics would profit a lot from learning more about psychology and incorporating some of those insights. However, there's also a big replication crisis in psychology, and we know that many of the studies that are published turn out not to replicate. Some of the most famous studies that you may have learned about in high school have turned out not to replicate. So how skeptical should we be about this whole body of knowledge? And I know that you have one person in your Substack, for example, saying, look, there are a lot of things that don't replicate, but these things do replicate. These things we can be reasonably certain about. So what elements of what we've been talking about does replicate? What are some famous examples of things that you may have learned in high school that don't replicate, but you should be skeptical about? And where can we be reasonably confident?
Crisis, that is a big deal, right? That has cast a huge shadow over the last decade or so of psychology, and it's really changed the landscape, how people think, certainly how I think when I'm teaching. I'm thinking, oh man, I've got to make sure that I'm teaching stuff that is as likely as I could hope to be true, right? Because there's an ethical issue there if you're standing in front of a classroom and telling people stuff, and if half the stuff that you're telling them is not true, you're really doing them a disservice once that's become clear. I do think it's a massive problem. I think we're slowly getting to grips with the problem, but I do think that there is knowledge within psychology that is pretty firm, and I think most of the stuff that we talked about today is in that category. I think the laws of behavior genetics, the findings of behavior genetics in general, are among the best replicated findings that we have. I think that evolutionary psychological stuff overall, I think, is not quite as well grounded yet as behavior genetics. Although that said, I do think that the research that's been done on topics like sex differences in particular is pretty solid. We have more than a century of research on sex differences, and in terms of applying an evolutionary lens to those, we have a lot of research from other species that we're applying there. So I think that's quite sturdy as well. Personality psychology, we talked about personality, research on IQ as well. That is among the most replicable research within psychology as well. It's interesting, a lot of the unpopular stuff seems to be quite well replicated, unfortunately, for some people. For people who don't like it, they are in this unfortunate situation where it seems to be quite the stuff that people don't like.
The really popular stuff, like the power pose, right? That you make a particular pose when you go on stage and suddenly it gives you more confidence. That doesn't tend to replicate. The things that people might want not to be true, like the predictability of IQ for life outcomes, that seems to replicate relatively well.
That is exactly right, yeah. Within the political sphere, I think I would say that is Up and coming. So of everything that we've talked about, I think the political stuff is probably the stuff that we will need to hone and make sure that that's replicating as well as possible. Probably everybody's heard of the Stanford prison experiment. That's one example of a very, very famous psychological finding that that hasn't replicated, and that's been kind of, I think, cast out and deemed to be largely misdescribed and inaccurate.
That's the one where they supposedly took a bunch of ordinary undergrads and they divided them arbitrarily into jailers and people who were jailed, and then the jailers started to act in sadistic ways, etc.
That's the one. That's Phil Zimbardo's work. Yeah, and he was kind of coaching them along. Yeah. So there's quite a long list. The marshmallow effect has I think. The current status of that would be, the marshmallow effect, where you get a 4-year-old kid, you put a marshmallow in front of them, you say, you can eat this marshmallow now if you want to, but if you just wait for a little while, just wait for a minute or so, and don't eat it, then we'll give you 2 marshmallows instead. That, I think it's fair to say that has replicated, but that's a lot weaker than it used to be. I actually have a list of unreplicated findings that I show to my students in one of my classes. Just wondering if I might want to grab that and
take a second to
good examples.
Yeah.
It's quite a long list. I have to make every year I have to make the font smaller on the list.
That's depressing.
Yeah. All right, where is it? Psychology, a changing field. All right, let's have a look. Other possible casualties. 10,000 hours. The bilingualism advantage, that people who speak 2 languages have a cognitive advantage over those who don't, seems not to have replicated. Brain training doesn't work. Makes you better at brain training exercises make you better at those exercises, but they don't generalize to other areas. Learning a musical instrument, unfortunately, does not generalize to other areas. Ego depletion.
I will tell that one to my mom, since she's a musician and I shamefully don't play a single instrument, so I can overcome my childhood shame.
Interesting. What else have we got? Mindfulness in schools protects kids against mental health problems. That doesn't seem to be the case. I got power posing that you mentioned earlier. That's on my list of things that haven't replicated. Repressed memories have been thrown out of the door. Terror management theory has been thrown away. Wearing red makes people more attractive. Apparently it doesn't. Dunning-Kruger effect has been challenged.
That's the one where if you think you're particularly good at something, you're particularly bad at something, or something along those lines?
Yeah, exactly. So people who score very, very high in IQ, for instance, they tend to underestimate their IQ somewhat, and people who score very, very low tend to overestimate their IQs somewhat as well. It's been argued that that's actually not... it's not really a thing. It's just regression to the mean. It's a statistical.
Yeah, I was going to say, presumably part of it is just that your guess is going to clump somewhat towards the middle. So if you're a real outlier, you may not realize the extent to which you're an outlier.
Yeah, exactly. Social priming. A lot of the priming effects that people used to talk about. Used to talk about 10, 20 years ago. Like if you see an older person, or you're primed with the idea of an older person, you'll walk more slowly than you otherwise would. All that stuff seems not to replicate. Sniffing oxytocin doesn't seem to make you nicer or more empathetic. Learning styles don't seem to be useful at all. There's a huge list. Yeah.
Amazing. I think the last one of these, which is not really a psychology one, but I guess comes from political science, is that there's this persistent idea that if you try to debunk a false claim, it will in fact make people believe the false claim more. And that I think has not replicated either. I've seen some studies which very much challenge that. So we haven't done any damage by going through this list of psychological effects that don't replicate. Hopefully listeners to this podcast will now know that they don't replicate rather than being reinforced in the belief in them. So I think it's very helpful to move beyond this phase of recognizing that there is a replication crisis in psychology, that we have to re-examine things very seriously, to realizing that now there's been a lot of attempts to replicate things, and many things have not replicated, and you've been generous in listing some of them, but some things have, and hopefully you've helped us think about some of the basics of how psychology can inform our political thinking and our thinking about the world in general today. So thank you for coming on the podcast and for taking the time.
Thank you. It was a really enjoyable conversation. I really enjoyed that, Yascha. Thanks very much.